In this video, we're going to be replacing the front hub bearing in this 2011 Honda Odyssey. All right, we're going to remove the wheel. We're going to use a 22mm socket. All right, so we're going to remove our caliper. We got two 14mm bolts. And we're going to loosen these up. We're not going to take them both out at the same time. We're going to loosen one up. And then we can actually just take the top one out. Now at this point you want to have some kind of bracket or wire or hanger handy. We're going to slide our caliper right off and hang it out of the way. So what we're going to do is actually hang it up on the strut with a spring here. So we're going to take our caliper right off. See if we can set it aside like that. Now we can take our pads out. We're going to start with our hardware. Just press these together and just pull it right out. And our pads, you just pull them right out. When you take your pads off, make sure not to get the pad faces greasy or oily at all. And now we can work on removing our caliper bracket. In the back here we have two 19mm bolts holding our caliper bracket on. These are usually torqued down to a higher spec, so we've moved to a breaker bar. And now we can remove our caliper bracket and set that aside. All right, now we can remove our rotor. Typically you'll have a couple of screws here, either flathead or Phillips. Our vehicle didn't come with them in there, so at this point we can just slide our rotor right off. Sometimes you have to give it a little persuasion with a rubber mallet. This one came right off. We can set this aside. So now what we're going to do is remove the axle nut. You can see it's been staked in to the axle itself. So we're going to have to open up that staking. And we only need it to open up enough to spin. We don't have to fully correct it. And a side note while doing this, you definitely want to have a new spindle nut to go back on here. The more you stake this, the weaker it becomes. You don't want this to break. Okay, now with the 36mm socket, we're going to remove our axle nut. On the back here we have four, two on this side, two on the other side, 17mm bolts go all the way through, holding our hub in place. We're going to take those bolts out now. So we're on a breaker bar. These have been in here a while, I'm assuming. They're going to take a little force to get moving. Now with a rubber mallet, we're going to push our axle backwards through, but we're actually going to use another hammer in place. All right, so we've got the axle set back enough. We don't have any play. It's really tight. It's in there good. Yours might need a lot more persuasion than ours did. Just keep at it. Just set that back. Basically just trying to get it free from the hub the best you can. So what we're going to try here is reinserting 2 of the bolts on opposite sides, almost all the way in. And we're going to hit these bolts from the back side here to try and drive our hub bearing assembly forward. So at this point, we've used a 4-pound sledge and we have the slightest bit of movement. You can see here that backing plate and the hub bearing flange are slightly separated, so we know we're in the right direction. What we're going to do is just soak this with some penetrant everywhere that the flange meets the backing plate and behind. And we're going to let this sit and do its work. Give it a few minutes and then we'll keep at the same process. We'll hit it from this side, we'll hit it from this side, we'll try and walk it off. It's going to take some time, it's going to take some patience, but you can get your hub bearing off. If you have a dust shield that looks like this, it may be worth replacing it. It's going to be very tough to repair this, but at this point, you can see your hub is loose. Work it left to right, back and forth, until you get it to the point where it'll come off. I think we're just about there, which means we can loosen our axle nut. We should now be able to take our hub off. So we're just going to give this area a thorough clean. We're going to start with some solvent. We'll move to a wire brush. And we'll probably finish off with some rust penetrant and some anti-seize. Off camera, I went and cleaned up this surface here. Just use a pneumatic tool with a small abrasive wheel. This isn't a sandpaper, it's not taking off material, it's just cleaning the surface. I did the same thing here where our caliper bracket will go. So now that our surface is clean and we've cleaned where the bearing will sit as much as possible, we're going to get our CV axle shaft ready for the new bearing install. What we're going to do here is actually clean this with a rag. We're going to apply a little bit of grease. We're going to put some grease in here as well, and we'll install the new bearing. All right, so we're going to put a little grease on our shaft spline. This is probably way more than we need, so we'll take some of that off and spread it around. What we're going to do is just put some grease where the mating surfaces are. So a little bit inside here. And on our hub, we're just going to put a little bit of grease around here. This is going to do 2 things. It's going to help with a little bit of vibration, a little bit of noise, and it's also going to help with corrosion protection. We can put our brake dust shield back in place now. Just going to set our bolts through, mainly just to hold the shield in place. We do recommend that if yours looks like this, you probably should replace it. All right, so it's not going anywhere. That's what we wanted. So you can see that there's a difference between top and side. These are a little wider, so we're going to locate the same on our flange for our bearing. Line that up the best we can. We're going to have to clock it onto the axle. Once we have it clocked onto the axle, what we can do is take those ears and spin them. Push our bearing into place. We're only going to be able to get it so far. When we get to that point, what we're going to do is put our axle nut on. Once we've gotten here, what we're going to do is put a little bit of tension forward or outward on our CV axle without pulling it too much. You don't want to separate it on the inside. And we'll thread on finger tight our axle nut. And that'll help just kind of keep it from falling forward at all. Now what we can do is see if we can start to thread in our bolts. We may have to slightly spin the flange. From this point, what we're going to do is tighten our bolts down. They're going to be 17 millimeter, and we're going to start and pull it in as much as we can before we feel good resistance. Then we're going to go in a crisscross pattern until our bearing is pulled in flush. Right about here is pretty good resistance. So what I'm looking for is how much of the bolt is coming through here on the flange. I'm trying to just make it even every time I go to one of the bolts. So right now we're about flush on two of them. This one and the one I'm doing now are about flush. We'll go a couple of turns more. And then we'll match it on the other two. We'll just keep working it in even. All right, so we're a couple of threads out here. We're a couple of threads out here. Because our backing plate and our brake dust plate here is a little deformed, it's going to be tough to tell when we're fully seated up and we have that gap closed. So just do your best, and if it looks like this, we recommend that you replace it. It makes this whole process much easier. Okay, our 4 bolts holding our bearing in place. We're going to torque those down now to 72 foot-pounds. All right, so the goal before you put your rotor on is to have a really clean surface here, which we do. But we have a little bit of grease and grime on here that we're going to remove with some brake clean. We're trying to prevent the best we can corrosion on this surface, which will aid in the removal of our rotor, should we ever have to, with some anti-seize. Here we can put our rotor back in place. Again, if you had Phillips screws or screws of any sort to hold your rotor to the hub, now's the time to reinsert them. We don't unfortunately have ours. All right, so we can install our caliper bracket. Line that up. Because we don't have a screw in our rotor, what I'm doing is holding our rotor in as flush as possible. And that'll help you get your bracket in place. Okay, so we want to snug these up but not tighten them all the way down, because we'll come back and torque them once we get our caliper on. Okay, so we can reinstall our brake pads. From here, we can install our hardware. Just going to squeeze them together, seat them in. Now we can move on to our caliper itself. Okay, so now we can take our caliper off of our hanger. We can take our caliper and put it over our pads. Because of these springs, we may have to compress our pads slightly. But because they're the same pads we removed the caliper from, we should not have to compress the piston. Okay, you can see what's stopping us in the back here is our guide pin. So what we can do is just squeeze that guide pin and put our caliper over. Now we can put our two caliper bolts in place. With a 14 millimeter, we're going to snug up our caliper bolts. We're going to torque down our two caliper bracket bolts now to 101 foot-pounds. And our two caliper bolts are going to be 37 foot-pounds. All right, before we put our axle nut on, we're just going to put a little bit of oil right around that surface and thread our nut on. With a breaker bar against the floor and to one of our lugs, we're going to stop the wheel from spinning, and we're going to torque down this axle nut to 242 foot-pounds. And then from here, what we're going to do is stake that closed, stop it from rotating. Okay, now that we have our lug nuts snugged up and we have the vehicle down on the ground with some weight on the suspension, we're going to torque our lug nuts to 94 foot-pounds in a crisscross pattern.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.